6th World Championship, a 5th consecutive Constructors' Championship, the youngest Grand Prix winner in history, the arrival of new contenders, and potential future world champions. We witnessed battles on the track and wars off it. 24 drivers, 14 countries, 16 races, 8 winners, 1 champion. Join us as we look back at the 2003 season in Speed Channel's Formula One Year in Racing. Hello and welcome to the 2003 edition of the Formula One Year in Racing. I'm Rick DeBrule, along with our regular Formula One broadcast team, David Hobbs, Steve Matchett, Peter Windsor. All right, guys, real quickly, what was your overall impression of this last season?
Well, Michael Schumacher won his 6th World Championship, but the season didn't get off to a very good start for him, bouncing over curbs in Melbourne and running into people in Malaysia. And at the end of the first 3 races, he hadn't been on the podium or anywhere looking like being on the podium. So he made a fine comeback, and of course we saw some very young pole sitters and winners in those first 2 races.
Great season for Michael Schumacher, of course. Great season for Ferrari at the end of the day. But for me, really, the rise of Michelin really was what it was technically. They were right up against the ropes at the end of last season, and they just come out absolutely fighting from round 1. Terrific dry weather tyre.
For me, it was the year that nobody wanted to win. As David said, Michael couldn't get it right at the start. Williams should have been taking advantage at that point. They didn't. When they got going, they dropped the ball. McLaren looked good. Then they brought their new car on, which didn't race. And at the end, Michael just kept plodding on and scoring points. And as you say, Michelin, a big part there. But don't forget, Ferrari is still on record as saying that they think the Michelin tyres were illegal in 2003. And that is a very profound statement that tainted the championship.
And ultimately changed the course of it as the season wound on. All right, we're just getting started here with the Formula One Year in Racing. When we come back, we'll take a look at the first part of the season. We'll also take a closer look at how the off-season rule changes affected the early rounds. Stick around. Welcome back to the Year in Racing. When you look back at the 2003 Formula One season, you may think about Ferrari taking both the Drivers' and the Constructors' Championship. But if you think back to the first part of the season, there was no clear-cut favorite. The season began in Australia, and the big question was, will the new rules mix up the grid? Well, the short answer would be no, as Michael Schumacher grabbed the pole. The race, however, proved to be much more exciting. After a Barrichello crash, a Raikkonen penalty, a Schumacher bargeboard failure, and a Montoya spin, the only man left to win was David Coulthard. So the verdict on the rule changes would have to wait.
You know, basically it happens.
On to Malaysia, where we saw the Renault team emerge as a serious threat after qualifying 1-2. However, as the race played out, it was McLaren and Ferrari up front, and Kimi Raikkonen took his first career win. Rubens Barrichello finishing second.
Kimi Raikkonen in Malaysia. Stunning stuff from the young Finn.
Well done.
Fernando Alonso, though, scored his first career podium and the first podium of the season for Renault. The Brazilian Grand Prix can only be described as bizarre. After a 20-minute rain delay, the race finally began behind the safety car. When the cars were finally released, it became a race of survival. Montoya, Pizzonia, Button, Verstappen, and even Michael Schumacher all fell victim to the Senna S. Barrichello ran out of fuel, and finally Mark Webber had this huge crash, which then caused Alonso to suffer this massive shunt. The race was red flagged and declared to be over. After a week-long debate, Giancarlo Fisichella was finally given the win. So with 3 races down, Michael Schumacher had yet to finish on the podium, but the next 3 rounds saw things return to normal. Michael won the San Marino, the Spanish, and the Austrian rounds of the championship, although this fire almost extinguished his chances in Austria.
Oh, and it's on fire. There's a fuel fire, and the fuel hose is stuck in.
I guess the mechanics felt I was a little bit too cold and cool and wanted to warm me up.
So after 6 rounds, despite winning 50% of the races, Michael Schumacher still found himself in 2nd place in the championship to Kimi Raikkonen. Barrichello was 3rd and Alonso 4th. All right, guys, after 6 rounds, the big question was, where was Williams?
They were struggling with their chassis, with what they were doing. Antonio Terzi had arrived, if you remember, from Ferrari to try and sort out the aerodynamics on the FW25. And I think she did a pretty good job. Aerodynamically, the car was working very well. But what they were struggling with was good old mechanical grip, which at the end of the day is getting the tyres to work with the tarmac. That's really where all your grip's going to come from. And it took a long while, I think, for the new generation of engineers to get to the grips with the fact, boys, you've got to give a little bit at the back end. It might upset the aerodynamics, it might not get the diffuser to work right, but you've got to get the tyres to grip. That's what they were struggling with.
Frank Durney came in and helped the team out. If Frank hadn't come in, would they have made it?
I don't think they would, but that was only half the job he had to do. The other half was not treading on the toes of all the engineers who were there, who didn't want to think that this old guy from the old guard knew something that they didn't. And Frank Durney is on record as saying now that if they had run last year's Williams, the 2002 FW24, in a similar way as Steve just described, it would be a quicker car than the FW25. So Williams, in fact, have probably been a bit wide of the mark of their sweet spot for quite a long time.
They did take a big gamble on the FW25. I remember them saying at the time, you know, if this car works, it'll be terrific. But the thing is, we're not entirely sure how it does work. If it will work, then we've got to try and figure out how it's working. Well, it was a big gamble for them. It took a long while for them to get on top of it.
And a very important...
They did look pretty terrible when you think about it, because they were the only people that had the new car at Melbourne, all ready to go. And in fact, Montoya was leading it till, of course, he spun near the end of the race. But then they just seemed to go downhill fast, and they had just terrible races in Malaya and Brazil.
And there was one other significant difference between the two cars. This was a 6-speed gearbox car. Interestingly enough, they seem to be going back to 7 speeds again next year. I wonder whether, with a 7-speed box, Montoya might have won Monza this year.
What else jumps out in those first 6 races? Anything in particular besides Giancarlo Fisichella winning his first race?
Michael Schumacher making 3 unbelievable mistakes in those first 3 races, choosing to start on the wrong tyres in Melbourne. This is the great Michael Schumacher, who never gets it wrong. He was the last guy on the grid. He knew what the weather was going to be doing, and he still managed to start on wets. What was he thinking? Secondly, running into the back of Jarno Trulli at turn 1 in Malaysia. Okay, you can be blown away from the start by the Renaults. It's a weird thing, this qualifying thing. Stay away from them in the first corner at least. And then what was he thinking in Brazil, going off under the yellows where other cars had gone off in a safety car environment? I mean, what was he thinking?
Of course, one of the rots set in for Kimi Raikkonen, who was still leading the championship at the end of this group of races. But in Melbourne, he was one of the first guys to really use the new rules on the formation lap. He radioed in and said, hey, you know, it's dry around here, and he chose to start from the pit lane on the right tyres, filled the thing up with gas, would have won the race, but they gave him a stop-start penalty for going too fast in the pit lane.
All right, 6 races into the 2003 season, and the new point system was already affecting the championship standings. We'll be right back with the second part of our 2003 season recap, where we will see the resurgence of the Williams team and the McLaren boys begin a mid-season slide. Stick around. Welcome back to the 2003 Formula One year in racing. Now, the first 6 races saw McLaren starting off strong, and Ferrari began flexing its muscles. Now, we move on to the Grand Prix of Monaco, where the pendulum began to swing in Williams' direction. Looking back, the Monaco Grand Prix can be cited as the first major battle in the 2003 tire war. Michelin runners occupied the first 4 slots on the grid and 8 of the top 10. The race was typical Monaco, with the only passing happening during pit stops, and in the end, it was Juan Pablo Montoya taking the first win of the year for Williams, with Kimi Raikkonen a close second. Michael was able to salvage third. The Formula One circus moved to this side of the pond for the Canadian Grand Prix, and Kimi Raikkonen fell victim to single-lap qualifying with this spin. The race began with both Williams drivers making up the front row, and all was looking well until Juan Pablo Montoya clipped the curb at the final chicane, sending him into a spin. That allowed Michael to close on his younger brother, and after the first round of pit stops, Michael was in the lead. Schumacher needed all his skill, though, to nurse his ailing brakes to the finish and claim his 4th win of the season. This would move him into the lead in the driver's points for the first time this year. Back to Europe, and at the Nürburgring and Magny-Cours, Williams looked unbeatable. Ralph and Juan finished 1-2 at both races, although it appeared that Raikkonen had the European Grand Prix wrapped up until his Mercedes power plant grenaded.
Oh, look what we're seeing there.
Oh, no!
Raikkonen's engine has gone.
These wins moved Williams to within 3 points of Ferrari in the constructors' standings. Silverstone was next, and no one could have predicted this one. After 2 safety car periods, one for David Coulthard's head support landing on the track, and the other for a madman running on the circuit, we saw the field mixed up from top to bottom. When it all panned out, Rubens Barrichello took his first win of the year, but Montoya and Raikkonen were right there for second and third. The German Grand Prix started off with a bang, literally. Ralf Schumacher moved up on Rubens Barrichello, which triggered a chain reaction, taking out several cars, including Kimi Raikkonen. Montoya checked out and easily won the race. Michael Schumacher had a golden opportunity to score second-place points, but a late race puncture demoted him to 7th. However, he would still hold a 6-point lead in the championship. So with 4 races to go, the Drivers' Championship was close, Manufacturers' Championship was close. Was this as simple as saying Michelin was excelling and Bridgestone was faltering?
Well, things with tyres, of course, are never simple. I think there were 2 factors here. One of the big rule changes last winter said that from here on in, basically the tyre companies could specialise. They could build compounds specific to the teams within their portfolio. Bridgestone really have Ferrari, so it didn't really affect anything they did. Michelin suddenly could build softer tyres for Renault, slightly harder tyres for McLaren, harder tyres still for Williams. So obviously that improved things from a Michelin point of view. Beyond that, over the winter, 3 circuits that were on the borderline of being a Bridgestone or a Michelin circuit in terms of how bumpy they were, the height of their curbs, suddenly became Michelin circuits. They changed the chicane at the Nürburgring. It became much softer, became a beautiful corner for Michelin. Monaco became a Michelin circuit overnight. They resurfaced 80% of that track. And at Magny-Cours, they added 2 more Michelin-type corners there, which took away anything that Bridgestone might have had there. So all of a sudden, Bridgestone had a massive uphill battle to face.
In mid-season, would you have been able to predict the Drivers' Championship at that point? Would you have put money down saying, I think this is what's going to happen? No,
but it was interesting. At this point of the season, Max Mosley was sort of patting himself on the back for having changed these rules and regulations, which was what making the racing open. But the fact was, it really was the resurgence of Michelin, because people like Jaguar and Renault, Jaguar had come from obviously nowhere last year, and although the car this year was a bit of an improvement, and Mark Webber was a huge improvement, nevertheless, the Michelin's really made that car look very, very good, and I think it helped Williams and McLaren a lot too. There's no doubt about it. The Michelin resurgence is what set the field, what set things afire, not the change in regulations.
Yeah, but Max was behind that change in regulations that allowed Michelin to specialise.
But a year ago, we sat here and you said, when we were talking about this bespoke tires, you said this is going to kill Michelin. They don't have the money, they don't have the finances, they're not going to be able to survive this.
Well, I was wrong about the money. I was wrong about the money because I really didn't think Michelin would do that, and I always thought that Bridgestone would outspend Michelin whatever they do, and that hasn't been the case, so I'm wrong about that. But what I'm not wrong about is the fact that Michelin have always been very, very good on smooth circuits, and if you make the circuit smoother, as they did, it's going to help Michelin, not Bridgestone.
Well, in your defence as well, Peter, I'd have to say, if you're a team manager at the end of 2002 and you were looking to sign up a tyre supplier, who would have gone for Michelin? I mean, Bridgestone was so dominant in 2002, everybody, I think, would have put their money on it. So an absolutely fantastic job to what you say as well. Really, Michelin coming to the fore was an absolute surprise to everybody.
So let's get back to the recap. So with 4 rounds remaining, everything was still up in the air. But with tight competition comes accusations and claims of foul play. The championship takes a sour turn when we come back. Season recap, Williams and Michelin were on a roll, and they anticipated Hungary would be no different. Well, Hungary did turn out to be a Michelin track, but it was not Williams that stole the show. As predicted, Michelin runners occupied 8 of the top 10 positions on the grid, with Fernando Alonso on the pole. As the race unfolded, Alonso would absolutely dominate the race. He lapped up to 7th place, which included Michael Schumacher.
Fernando Alonso takes the final turn, comes onto the front straightaway. He'll take the checkered flag to become the youngest Formula One winner in history.
Raikkonen finished 2nd, the Williams boys 3rd and 4th. The highest Bridgestone runner was Michael Schumacher, and he could only manage 8th place. Following Hungary, Ferrari and Bridgestone accused Michelin of supplying illegal tires, pointing out that after long runs, the Michelins would wear down to illegal widths. Well, after 3 weeks of arguments and threats, Michelin was forced to supply new tires for the Italian Grand Prix. Michael Schumacher won the race, with Montoya finishing 2nd. Ferrari got what it wanted, but many in the pit lane lost respect for the Scuderia based on the tactics that they employed. Back across the pond to Indy, and Kimi Raikkonen looked poised to keep his title hopes alive after grabbing the pole and led the race early on. Juan Montoya had championship hopes as well, but they were dashed after he was given a drive-through penalty for this questionable overtaking attempt that left Rubens Barrichello beached. Following a rainstorm that saw everyone elect intermediate tires, the track began to dry, and much like in Brazil, the Bridgestones were dominant. Michael Schumacher was able to take the win, but by finishing second, Raikkonen was still alive heading into Japan, as were Williams in the constructors' fight. In Japan, Williams' hopes of winning the constructors' title went up in smoke early on, as Montoya's BMW would quit. Raikkonen would need to win this race to have any chance at the championship. But Rubens Barrichello was the class of the field, and he won the race from the pole. That meant that Michael Schumacher would take his record-setting 6th World Drivers' crown, and Ferrari would win its 5th consecutive Constructors' Championship.
Michael Schumacher crosses the line, and he is the world champion for 2003.
So Michael Schumacher made history, but when you look back at this season alone, what stands out?
Well, of course, after Hungary, when they had just a disastrous event, Barrichello's car broke a suspension, which they feebly said was because he climbed the curb once too often. But, of course, Michael finished 8th. Montezemolo just gave the team a most horrendous shake-up and said this must never happen again. And, of course, at that point, they started pointing at the Michelin tyres, which, in my opinion, were illegal. All these weird arguments, people saying, well, it doesn't say anything in the rules about measuring at the end of the race. I mean, have you ever heard anything so pathetic? I mean, where do you expect to measure them? Expect to measure them. It's like saying the ride height's going to be, you know, 1.5 inches, and at the end of the race, it could be dragging on the ground. I mean, you know.
But I mean, really, Dave, that's always been the case in Formula One, hasn't it? Look at the ride heights of the cars before, back in the 80s when they used to be set, and then they just lift them up with pneumatics, go over the check zone, and put them back down again. And really, in Michelin's defence, I think if the rules said that the tyres were going to be checked before the race, then I think Michelin have every right to make that tyre 270 mil, which is the maximum limit. Now, of course, if then the FIA, for whatever reason, and let's say we know that it was Ferrari that instigated this, said, let's check the tyre width after the race, then, of course, Michelin must adjust that policy. But I don't think there's anything that Michelin were particularly doing wrong. They were working to the absolute nth degree of the regulations.
Absolutely, but all I know is that if Ferrari had come up with the same stint and the Bridgestones had been wide at the end of the race, their whole world would have gone completely ballistic.
And it's very Machiavellian, the timing that they used to bring that out.
Well, it was ridiculous, and it all happened at the Ferrari test track. The FIA meeting about all this and the decision about it came out of this Ferrari meeting. It was ridiculous. And David, I'm not sure you're right about this business of we should always measure at the end of the race, because the reason they thought it would always be measured at the start of the race is because there was a big confusion about tread widths the previous year. And to clarify that, the FIA said it will only be measured at the start of the race, and the regulation reads relevant to everything at the start of the race, not to the end of the race, and now they've had to re-clarify it. So I don't think Michelin can be blamed for any of it.
Did that protest change the outcome of the championship, do you think?
It certainly caught Michelin off guard because they were forced to come up with a new construction of tyre and make their tyres slightly narrower.
And the teams had to spend time working on that.
But you know, in Ferrari's defence, of course, if you know that you've got a possibility of having a team over because of something you found out technically on their car, you wait until you need to use that shot. It's no good complaining at the start of the season when there was no advantage. The advantage would have been lost to Ferrari. They timed it perfectly. That's F1.
And that's the way Ferrari managed to pull it off. Well, that wraps up the highlights portion of the program, but stick around because we have much more to discuss, including technology, safety, and next season's rule changes. We'll be right back.
Down there in 6th, he was hanging in 3rd spot most of the year, got pushed out right at the end.
Cristiano Damana finishing 13th, the best rookie with 10 points. Villeneuve only got 6 points for the entire season. Amazing when you figure out that Marc Genet and Takuma Sato got 4 points and 3 points respectively with only 1 race for the season. Now let's talk about the constructors' points. Steve?
Well, once again, it is the big 3 that take the top 3 positions. Ferrari there, winning their 5th consecutive Constructors' Championship with 158 points there. McLaren had 4 consecutive Constructors' Championships, 88, 89, 1991. But Peter, I think 5 consecutive Constructors' Championships is an absolutely fantastic record and another record.
Absolutely, and it's all to do with reliability. Engine, gearbox, chassis, wishbones aside. Michael hasn't had a mechanical failure in a race for over 2 years.
That is amazing, isn't it?
Not just reliability to talk about this year, but we also talk about safety, because 2003 was a remarkably safe season in Grand Prix racing. However, we did have some very scary moments, like Button's crash in Monaco or Furman's in Hungary. And amazingly, no one was seriously hurt, and that just shows how well built these Grand Prix cars really are. So let's take a moment and look back at some of this year's moments that both the teams and the drivers would like to forget.
Please, 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 don't shunt the cars.
That's David Coulthard.
Coulthard, what the heck happened there?
Oh, Michael spins out.
Michael's beat.
That is a big accident. There's 3 corners written off the car. Oh, there's a shunt. I think that's Raikkonen. Yeah.
Rubens Barrichello's hit the wall. Side by side, Roger Schumacher.
Game over.
So let's talk about safety. David, obviously changed drastically from when you were driving. The big change this year for the drivers was the Hans device. Did it make a difference, do you think?
Well, I think it did. That crash with Ralph Furman at Hungary, when he slid down the road and hit that tyre barrier sideways on, I mean, he was still going about 100 miles an hour. The Hans device will certainly helped him. And, of course, Rubens Barrichello in the same race where he went straight off there where the rear suspension broke. Must have helped him a lot. I think the Hans device is here to stay. Everybody complaining about it. Now you don't hear a thing about it.
It was a big deal during the off-season, and then Rubens Barrichello wouldn't run it in the first race, and then suddenly, after the second race, did anybody talk about it at all?
Exactly the same happened in, I think it was 96 when the high cockpit sides were introduced. The drivers didn't like it because it was new. Like we've all been saying, they don't like change, and exactly the same thing happened with the Hans device. It's something new, they felt uncomfortable, they have to get used to it. Once they got used to it, as you say, never heard of
That high cockpit side also helped Furman a lot, I would think.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it.
One of the reasons the Hans work so well in Formula One so quickly is because we all know Formula One drivers are a bit, precious. But they had this guy, James Penrose, a great technician, got a lot of experience working for helmet companies in there at every race, working with each driver individually, and he did a great job. Interesting looking at those accidents. I'd forgotten that Fernando Alonso had that accident under the yellow and was not penalised at all because he was slightly injured. But there's an anomaly for you. Montoya gets thrown out of the US Grand Prix for, lightly touching Rubens. Alonso has that massive accident under yellow and no penalty whatsoever.
And Schumacher spun in the same race under yellow and crashed, and no penalty either.
Yeah. All right, time to take another quick break. When we return, we'll take a look at the technological aspects of the sport and pick Steve Matchett's brain just a little bit. Stick around.
Marriage. How can I get to that? You can see that, right? That's just like that, and then hit that 3 times. All right, here we. All right, I need to. Exactly how this fuel rig goes onto the car is of great interest, I think. I'm going to do that again and cut that a little shorter. For those Speed Channel viewers that have also been watching the F3000 series, you may remember that Giorgio Pantano in the Durango went Formula. Okay. For those avid, all right, I know what I'm going to say now. For those avid Speed Channel vision, oh dear, no, I don't. One of the mechanics was struggling to get the pin back in before the car was set out back. Okay. That was good though, wasn't it? Yeah, well, that was some of my best material.
Obviously, you need to pay the producers more around here. Notice David and I weren't in there. Our mistakes aren't remembered forever. All right, let's get back to the meat of the program. Formula One claims to be the pinnacle of the automotive technology. However, this season saw the teams faced with some new restriction. Now, fortunately, we have our own Steve Matchett when he's on the spot to figure it all out.
For those that consider Formula One's raison d'etre to be the pursuit of technical excellence, the draconian measures announced by Max Mosley at the conclusion of 2002 all sounded somewhat worrying. His initial proposal was that, along with special qualifying cars, launch and traction control, telemetry and all radio transmissions would be outlawed. Single lap qualifying was to be introduced, and following that brief spurt the cars would remain in Parc Fermé until Sunday morning, effectively preventing the teams working on them overnight. By severely limiting the allowable technology, the president hoped to reduce costs and level the playing field, in essence providing a lifeline to Minardi and Jordan, and perhaps handing McLaren and Williams a greater chance to take the fight to Ferrari. Mosley's news was a bombshell, but after much political wrangling, a compromise was reached. His new qualifying rules would be enforced, but the only new engineering restriction was the loss of pits-to-car data transmission, the two-way data link that McLaren had used to such great effect in 2002, saving their Mercedes engine from failing and handing Coulthard the Monaco win. Throughout 2003, the overwhelming challenge for the engineers and mechanics was to ensure their car's race reliability. The teams now prevented, during Saturday night, from carrying out their usual painstaking race preparation work. In more general engineering terms, the greatest strides in performance were found through tyres and aerodynamics. And there can be little argument that Michelin were the stars of the show. They finished 2002 up against the ropes, punch-drunk by Bridgestone's relentless assault. Michelin knew they had to regroup and fight back, and they did just that. The tyre war entered a new phase, and certainly as far as dry weather tyres are concerned, the shift of power swung in Michelin's favour. Sure, Bridgestone may have won both championships, but the job was nowhere near as easy as last season, and now the Japanese supplier will be pleased to hear the bell, to take a deep breath before the next round. For their part, the aero guys concentrated on drag reduction. The rear of the car became even narrower. The panels adjacent to the transmission pulled as tight as possible to help channel the turbulent air away from the rear tyres. Several teams ran new rear wings too. The traditional straight look seemed out of vogue. These new elements featured a more stylistic approach, a little Dali-esque. Their swooping lines were intended to further reduce drag with no loss to downforce production.
So, Steve, here's the question. What won the championship this year? Was it the driver's ability or the team's ability?
Well, I think it was reliability, and I really think that's what played a big part in it. And I have to say, Michelin produced some fantastic dry weather tyres, we've already talked about. Where they did fall off a little bit was still they were lacking on their intermediate tyres. Up until, well, let's say Indianapolis, right towards the end of the season, their intermediate tyres were something like 3 seconds off the pace in comparison to Bridgestone. After Indianapolis, those new generation of intermediate tyres that Michelin produced were about 1.5 seconds, a lap off the pace. So a big advantage was gained there, but still 1.5 seconds a lap. They've got to do better than that next year for intermediate tyres.
But there is still this massive difference in philosophy between Bridgestone and Michelin. Bridgestone basically have a narrow tyre with round shoulders. Michelin have a big fat tyre, big square shoulders, stiffer sidewalls. And it's pretty obvious that in the wet, a big square tyre is going to be slower than a nice narrow tyre. Equally, on a nice smooth dry surface, the square tyre is going to work. It's odd to me that they haven't yet sort of, you know, done what Formula One teams do and started to copy one another's best bits.
Well, it seems to me that what they might have to do now is for Bridgestone to produce a much squarer tyre for the dry.
Well, yeah, but they're not doing that, are they? That's the weird thing.
The expense, of course, is just horrific. The development cost these tyre companies have to put up with must be just gruesome.
To me, what was interesting this year was towards the end when Ferrari suddenly realized the chips were down, and you wonder how many hours were spent back at that shop, how much money was spent that wasn't probably budgeted at the beginning of the year to pull this championship out.
How many hours were spent running Ferrari engines on the dyno? That's what I'd like to know. How many engines they went through this year to get to that reliability. Incredible performance.
I think that is the most, of all the technology that we see, the aerodynamics, the suspension, the mechanical grip, the tyres, the most amazing thing to me is that a race engine now can do 19,000 RPM and takes 2 years for Michael Schumacher to last break an engine. I mean, it's almost unbelievable.
Like Steve said, reliability. Well, time to take another break, but first we've got a trivia question for you. The 2002 season saw the podiums dominated by Ferrari, Williams, and McLaren, with Eddie Irvine somehow sneaking in there at Monza. But this season was entirely different. So how many different teams were represented in the interview room following the final qualifying session and races? The answer when we return. So, did you get the answer to the trivia question? Every team had at least one representative in the interview room, with the exception of 2, BAR and Minardi. A side note to that, 13 different drivers made appearances, both drivers from Ferrari, Williams, McLaren, Renault, and Toyota, in addition to Frentzen, Weber, Fisichella, and even Jean Todt graced the unilateral room with their presence. All right, now on to the teams. For several decades, we have been referring to Ferrari, McLaren, and Williams as the big three of Formula One. Now, occasionally, a team like Benetton will sneak in and shake things up. Well, 2003 saw the big three joined by a new contender, Renault. Following their dominant performance in 2002, everyone expected Ferrari to walk away with both championships in 2003. Now, although they did win both the driver and the constructor championships, it was much more difficult than last year. Ferrari started behind the 8 ball, following 3 DNFs in the first 3 races, but as true champions usually do, they bounced back with 3 consecutive victories and in the end won 8 of 16 races. Williams entered 2003 believing that they would be Ferrari's main challengers, but early in the year, the FW25 chassis was very unstable and nervous at the rear end. However, from Monaco on, they fixed any problems they may have had and won 4 races. In the end, they fell just short of Ferrari and held off McLaren for second in the championship. McLaren began the year with the development of the 2002 chassis, the MP417D, and by the end of the season, they were still using it. Considering that the chassis was last year's model, McLaren did a phenomenal job to remain competitive and to keep Kimi Räikkönen in the championship hunt until the season's end. Renault entered 2003 with big aspirations, and they most certainly achieved them. Fernando Alonso grabbed 2 pole positions and won the Hungarian Grand Prix. Renault was viewed as a threat by the big 3 at each round, and in scoring 88 points, one has to wonder how different the championship race at the top would have been if Renault hadn't been as competitive as it was. So, Peter, looking back, were you surprised at Renault, or did you expect it all along?
I was surprised. I think Renault was surprised. They've always felt they've been lacking in power, but with the softer Michelins, with the better Michelins, and also being able to run on Friday mornings in that unofficial session, they just blew everybody away. It was fantastic. They actually chose those race-winning tyres in Hungary at Hockenheim 3 weeks before in the Friday session without initiating the long runs. That is serious operation. And there's no way Ferrari, McLaren or Williams really could compete with that.
And they've definitely got this drag downforce coefficient dead right, because they were very fast in straight line at lots of places, there's no doubt about it. But of course the king of being fast in a straight line was Ferrari pretty much throughout the year, except BMW, Williams at a couple of places were very quick in a straight line, but Ferrari were always quick in a straight line. And now John Illy has gone, the aerodynamicist has gone from Renault to Ferrari.
We talked about Williams adapting, but what about McLaren? I mean, you know, starting with last year's chassis, talking about a new one, but never delivering?
Yeah, the new McLaren chassis, the MP418, never raced at all. And if you look really at McLaren's performance, they took a big dip right in the middle of the season where they started to put a lot of their efforts towards that car. Then they realised, whoa, hang on, this car's got problems. It failed the crash test for the FIA, had front-end instability, they had engine installation problems. All of a sudden it was back away from that, boys, get the efforts back onto the old car again. McLaren's performance started to lift up a little bit, but they lost a lot of money, a huge amount of money. But more important in Formula One terms, a lot of development times that cost them dearly, concentrated on the new car that never was.
Big mistake from McLaren. They took the wrong guy from Arrows. Great car at Arrows, Sergio Rinland, Mike Coughlin. Sergio was the guy. They took Mike Coughlin, the structural engineer. Car was a disaster. It's amazing that McLaren, even McLaren, can make a mistake like that.
Doesn't get much bigger than that. Didn't seem to have much luck with any of their development as the year went on.
All right, let's talk about the next tier of teams, the ones that showed some promise late in the season. In fact, they each led a Grand Prix at one point in time. So let's take a closer look at BAR, Sauber, Jaguar, and Toyota. BAR secured the best of the rest honors thanks mostly to the performances of Jenson Button. The young Brit scored points in 7 races, had 4th place finishes in both Austria and Japan, and even led the U.S. Grand Prix for 14 laps. Jacques Villeneuve, well, he only managed 6 points in 15 races, while Takuma Sato scored 3 in only 1 round. Sauber started the season strong with 8 points in the first 3 rounds, but sadly fell off the pace during the middle of the season. They ended the year strong, though, with Heinz-Harald Frentzen reaching the podium at Indy. The pressure to perform has been on Jaguar for several years now, and although they only finished 7th in the championship, there were signs of promise. Mark Webber qualified third in both Brazil and Hungary. He scored points in 7 races and led briefly at Indy. Antonio Pizzonia and Justin Wilson also drove for the team, but their performances can only be described as mediocre at best. Toyota entered only their 2nd season of Grand Prix racing with a veteran and a rookie behind the wheel. The team continued to show signs of improvement throughout the year, culminating when Cristiano Damata led the British Grand Prix. Both Panis and Damata also qualified as high as 3rd at Indy and Suzuka. If Toyota continues to spend money wisely on their Formula One effort, they should be a true contender in a few years. So, Peter, is Toyota spending the money wisely?
I don't think they are, no. I mean, it's very easy to say, yes, they're doing very well considering they're a new team, but considering they're Toyota, considering the sort of money they have, it's not that difficult to get the basic parameters right. Very good engineering, get the team located in the right place, get the thing operating in a smooth way, don't fire your drivers after year 1, don't base it in Germany, and don't start changing engineers the way they are. It all reeks of a team that's sort of grabbing at whatever happens to be the hot topic of the moment, rather than a team that knows what it's doing and is growing organically, the way Williams, the way the great teams used to grow.
Steve, let's talk about Sauber, because they've nibbled at greatness and they floundered.
Yeah, it didn't work for them at all this year, did it? Remember, they're still using what is basically a 2-year-old car. It's a twin-keel car, and of course they were on Bridgestones. Well, all the Bridgestone runners suffered. And I think really the Bridgestone tyres in previous years have kind of flattered Sauber's performance. They've got a lot of work to do. However, they have just spent a colossal sum of money on an up-to-date, absolute state-of-the-art wind tunnel, which should give them the benefit. But with that Ferrari engine, ultra-reliable Ferrari engine, they must do better.
And BAR and Jag, well, Jaguar seem to have spent all their money because now we're hearing talk they're going to get a paying driver for next year. BAR, well, maybe they're going to make some progress. Who knows with Jenson Button and Takuma Sato. Hopefully they will.
Honda expects a lot next year. The
Honda
question
will
is,
be expecting a great deal, I'm imagining.
Can they deliver? All right, time now to check in with the backmarkers, although it seems hard to say backmarker considering that one of these teams actually won a Grand Prix. Here's the story on Jordan and Minardi. Eddie Jordan switched to Ford Power for 2003 looking for more reliability, but the chassis-engine combination just didn't prove very effective. The Irish team was strapped for cash and the chassis development reflected it. Giancarlo Fisichella did, however, win the Brazilian Grand Prix thanks to a lot of rain and an early stopping of the race. Minardi started the season from scratch when Paul Stoddard switched both tire and engine suppliers. As usual, the Minnows languished at the back of the field and sadly could not score a single point even with the new system. There was one bright spot, however, when Jos Verstappen did take provisional pole for the French Grand Prix in a bizarre wet-dry session. Minardi is Minardi, but is this nearing the end of the road for Jordan?
Well, I mean, it's just ridiculous. It wasn't that long ago that Jordan were winning races and he had great people with him. He's since lost Mike Gascoigne, Sam Michael, Bob Bell, all gone to different teams. Why has this happened? Because Eddie Jordan suddenly became a very rich man. He sold a minority share of his company, became a trillionaire overnight, the boat at Monaco, this and that. All the burning desire left his life. He still loves racing, he still loves the whole thing, but it's not the same Eddie Jordan that it used to be. And I think all the guys that used to work with him saw that coming.
The hunger's gone.
A great win for Fisichella in Brazil, there's no doubt about that. However, they were extremely lucky because if you remember, about 2 laps later, as soon as he comes in park for May, Fisichella's car burst into flames, so there's no way the car would have finished the race if it had kept going anyway.
But it's in the record books, and that's what matters. When we come back, it will be time to look ahead to next year. Once again, the format of race weekends has been altered, which will give us plenty to discuss, and we also have some good news regarding the TV package. Stick around.
The 2003 Formula One Year in Racing is brought to you by Pioneer Plasma Display.
18 rounds are scheduled to take place. Bahrain has been added and Austria has been removed. The European Grand Prix shifts to the end of May. Canada is still up in the air, but for now looks like it'll be run on June 13th. The U.S. Grand Prix will move to June 20th. The French Grand Prix is scheduled for July 11th, but that is probably going to be excluded. The very popular Belgian Grand Prix at Spa has returned to the schedule with the addition of the Chinese Grand Prix that will precede Japan. Finally, the Brazilian Grand Prix becomes the final race of the year on October 24th. However, it appears that it too may be dropped from the schedule altogether. What do you think of the new calendar?
Well, 18 races is a lot of races, but personally myself, I think that from a cost point of view, the teams complain about doing more races, but I really think they should just ban all testing and have like 19 or 20 races and make them a 4-day weekend and do all the testing there.
The Jacques Villeneuve proposal.
I think that's a great idea, because all the testing is lost to our TV audience. That's what we want to see. So if we can force the teams to be running at the race weekend where we can have the cameras, yeah, that's what we want to see, isn't it?
And you're concerned they won't even be running on Friday now.
No, exactly. But it's interesting looking at that calendar to see how international Formula One has become now. We've got China and Bahrain in there. Asia's looking very strong for Formula One. And this old thing that Bernie and Max have been saying, do we need the British Grand Prix, for example? You know, they're sort of right, aren't they? Because we're talking a global sport here. And here in the States, we think, how many people watch the US Grand Prix at Indianapolis? How many people watch it on television around the world? That's the real question. And that's what that calendar's all about. Very, very international. One other point. Do you think Bernie definitely wants Rubens to win the World Championship? That's why Brazil's on last, the finale, the whole thing. You can always tell the way he's thinking in terms of what teams and drivers he's looking at by looking at the calendar.
We should mention that's your prediction.
I would never have thought of that.
The highlight for me on the calendar has got to be that Spa is back on the circuit.
Yeah, that's going to be great, yeah.
It was an absolute shame it was taken off this year. Yeah. Fantastic that it's back on the calendar.
And of course,
again.
the one engine rule for the weekend is surely going to shape how people do, in fact, spend those 2 hours on Friday and even some of the practice on Saturday.
Well, they'll have to run on Friday because, remember, the compound choice of the tyres has to be set by 9 a.m. on Saturday. So the only way the teams are going to know what compound of choice of tyre is to run on Friday. That's why that rule's been put in there. But the one engine per weekend rule is going to be very difficult to police. Are the FIA going to lead seal the heads to the cylinder blocks to stop the mechanics basically stripping and rebuilding the engine overnight? That's what I've heard. I've also heard that things like water pumps, hydraulic pumps, oil pumps will be allowed to be changed.
But the race promoters need to do something to bring Friday to life because it is going to be a flat time. Maybe there should be a race for TV presenters and commentators. BMW or somebody can provide the cars. But David Hobbs can start from the back of the grid. It'd be fantastic.
And charge his way through. All right, we're going to take a break. We're going to come back in just a moment, and we'll wrap things up. Formula One roundtable discussion, which will include topics like the new rules, Michael's Championship, the Young Guns, and just about everything else that happened this past year. You can check out the Formula One roundtable at these times. Gentlemen, time to wrap this thing up. Your final thoughts. David, you get to go first.
Well, the 2003 season's over. Schumacher's won his 6th World Championship, but I think that the most surprising thing was that Montoya's move. He's going to go move to McLaren in 2005, and though he says it, Frank Williams says it won't destabilise things, I can't help but feel it's going to be very destabilising for the Williams team in 2004. And also there's going to be an awful lot of other people who are going to be spending an awful lot of time working out how they can drive the Williams in 2005.
Steve? Well, for me, I'm interested to see how Bridgestone fight back after Michelin have really had them up against the ropes this year. I think they've got the technology, they've got the engineering experience to be able to do it. What are Michelin going to do with those intermediate wet tyres? That's what they need to concentrate on. And really, I want to see how reliable these one engine per weekend engines are going to be.
For me, Montoya's performance under pressure when he had a chance to win the championship in 3 races starting from Hungary, very disappointing. I was very surprised he reacted that way. He could have won the championship. And why did McLaren start Kimi Raikkonen from the back of the grid in the Spanish Grand Prix? If he'd finished 4th from the pit lane, he'd be world champion. Elementary decision, should have taken it.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, guys. As we wrap up this Formula One year in racing, this will mark a first for our Formula One coverage on Speed Channel. It will be the first time in 8 years that we can proudly say that Formula One will live on speed for the 2004 season and beyond. So thanks for joining us for Formula One's Year in Racing, and be sure to check in all winter for Speed Channel's other Year in Racing programs. For David Hobbs, Steve Matchett, and Peter Windsor, I'm Richard Brohl. We had a great time in 2003. We look forward to seeing you back here in March for the Australian Grand Prix. The long winter's cold is over. It is time to start the 2003 Formula One season.
Raikkonen's engine as
Michael spins out.
Michael's beat.
Can you pass on the outside of that corner then?
I guess you can. It's not his job to make me happy.
He'll take the checkered flag to become the youngest Formula One winner in history.
Find something else. This doesn't work.
Michael Schumacher crosses the line, and he is the world champion for 2003.
Hello and welcome to our third annual Formula One Roundtable edition of Speed Channel's Year in Racing series. I'm Rick DeBrule along with our Formula One broadcast team. We've got a former driver, David Hobbs, former mechanic, Steve Matchett, and a former Formula One team manager, Peter Windsor. Currently the extraordinary cast of Speed Channel's Formula One crew. We don't want to forget the present. And we're going to start off with the big topic right off the bat, which is we have to talk about Michael Schumacher. 6th world championship, now holds the record. Does this settle it? Is he the greatest Formula One driver of all time? Come on, guys.
Well, he's won the most races, he's won the most number of championships, but he's not as good as Jim Clark, is he?
Because? Now you
well, no, that's another question. Well, he doesn't have as many pole positions as Ayrton Senna for a start, so he doesn't actually dominate all the divisions. And the era in which he raced is conducive to staying alive and doing a lot of racing. So, of course, it's very difficult to compare the stats going back to year one. It's actually impossible to compare eras with era. We all know that, I think. But certainly of this period, boring answer, Michael is undoubtedly the best driver of his generation.
All time.
No, Jim Clark.
Steve?
Is he the greatest of all time? I don't know, because I think it's very difficult to compare era for era. I think the machinery has been so different, certainly from Fangio's day. And remember, in Fangio's day, not only you're changing teams halfway through the season, well, that sort of thing doesn't happen any longer. How exciting is it for the sport? I think it's absolutely fantastic, personally. And as I've said during the season, leading up to this point right now, Michael Schumacher taking that 6th world championship is something I never thought would ever happen. I never thought that Fangio's record of 5 would ever be exceeded. We got very close with Prost, but of course when Prost retired at the end of the 93 season, I was thinking, well, that's it, we're back to square one. And all of a sudden Michael Schumacher starts totting them up one after the other, one after the other. I think it's an absolutely fantastic period in the sport's history, basically because we're here and we've seen it. We saw it happen this year. It's a historical moment.
So it's better than Fangio just because you were able to see it?
I think so, yeah, because when Fangio won that championship, or the 5 championships, the people back then were thinking, wow, we're seeing something exciting happen now. Well, all of us that have been involved in the sport, watching it at home and in the studio, have seen something that's absolutely remarkable and quite unique, and we were part of it.
Unique.
Absolutely unique.
Well, it can't be quite unique either. It's either unique or it's not. Sorry, carry on.
Nearly unique. I have to agree with Peter to a certain extent. Jimmy Clark was an absolutely fantastic driver, and his big strength was that he would set the pole position, and then on the opening lap, he always came over the line about 3 seconds in front of anybody else. Of course, this is when the cars were very different. Michael Schumacher, is he the best of all time? Boy, that is a difficult question, but I think he's certainly right up there, because one of the things he set himself the task of doing was winning the World Championship in Ferrari, who at the time were going through a particularly delicate period, i.e. they hadn't won the World Championship for 20 years, and finally when he won it, that was the first time they won a championship in 20 years. And a lot of that was not just his driving, it was his presence in the team and what he did for the team. And you do have to take all that into account.
All right, let's take something even better than just looking at Michael Schumacher. Was this his best championship? Or does it go back to that first one? Is it better than the one before?
No, I don't think this was his best championship, quite honestly. It was obviously pretty tough, and they got caught on the back foot this year badly by the tyre situation, I think, and then he made a couple of mistakes. And of course, the race
but
that
they had
won
to recover to win this one.
Well, the one that won in the championship, because ironically, the Japanese Grand Prix was one of the worst drives I've ever seen him do. I mean, he just ran into anything that was there. He ran into it. I mean, he just had a terrible race. Got his 1 point, and of course, Rubens Barrichello, his teammate, won the race, which stopped Raikkonen anyway.
Briefly, guys, almost out of time. What do you think? Where does this fall in the championship?
I don't think this is his best championship year because the car was so superior. Okay, they had the other differential with the tyre situation, but I think the 94 championship, his first one in inferior equipment, that's one that stands out for me.
Peter, quickly?
Michael made too many mistakes as a driver this year for it to be his best championship.
So a good one, but not a great one, but more importantly, the historic one. All right. We'll be back in a moment to discuss the new generation of Formula One drivers, Raikkonen, Alonso, Montoya, Webber, Button. Which one will be the next great champion? Stick around.
The 2003 Formula One Roundtable is brought to you by Pioneer Plasma Displays, taking high-definition television to a whole new level, and by Subaru, driven...
Remember, Jenson Button in the VAR is continuing the lead.
Kimi Raikkonen in Malaysia has been a class of his own.
And now Fernando Alonso takes the final turn, comes onto the front straightaway. He'll take the checkered flag to become the youngest Formula One winner in history.
Welcome back. We've seen the emergence this year of a lot of young drivers who seem destined to become the stars of Formula One. The question is, which one will be the next Michael Schumacher? Will it be Kimi, Alonso, Montoya, Webber, others? What do you think, guys? Who's the next world champion of that young crowd?
Well, I suppose one would have to say that probably Montoya is going to be the next world champion because he's had the more experience than the other ones. But the two guys that really look good to me are Kimi Räikkönen and, of course, Fred Alonso, who's just absolutely extraordinary. When you consider his age and experience, I mean, he's absolutely outstanding. You know, on the pole for the second race this year, had his first win at Hungary. And not only did he win, I mean, he absolutely trampled on him, lapping, of course, among others, Michael Schumacher.
And remember as well about Alonso.
Of course, he would never been able to lap Jimmy Clark.
If memory serves right, Alonso failed to finish, what, 5 races, and all of those 5 races were down to mechanical problems. Everything else, all the other races, he finished in the points.
Well, the one mechanical problem he had was when the chassis broke in half and he hit the wall at Brazil.
Yeah, let's not forget that one. That was some odd mechanical failure.
Yeah.
But to say that that guy's come in and finished in the points pretty much every race and would have probably done the other 5 if it wasn't for those problems, that's pretty outstanding for a debut season.
And, of course, his fighting spirit really came to at Monza. Well, I mean, he kept driving off the road. If you remember when across the chicane there, the bottom comes off the car, the barge boards flapping about, and on the last, like, 10 laps of race, he was going as quick as the leaders and got a point for 8th. And I mean, the car must have been absolutely terrible.
Just proves we don't need those darn barge boards anyway. Peter?
Well, I don't think any of them are going to dominate Formula One the way Michael has, though, because none of them are going to be in the position that Michael created at Ferrari, where he basically ran the team. He called the shots. It was his engineers, his mechanics, his second driver, his team manager. It was Michael's show. And none of the new guys are going to be doing that. Alonso's a Renault driver probably for life. Kimi's probably at McLaren for life. And those teams have very different characters. It's going to be a very, very close new era, I think.
Is Webber as good as Kimi or Fernando Alonso?
I think he's as good in a different sort of way. He's a very, very well-rounded driver. Of all the drivers out there capable of doing with a team what Michael did, I think Webber is the guy. He's got the brains and he's also got the speed and the ability to do it, whereas the others are just basic racers, you know, that we all love them, of course, but Webber's the guy with the brains. The interesting thing about this is nobody's talking about Jenson Button anymore. I mean, he was the big hero a couple of years ago, the guy of the future,
just going to ask you about
completely
Jenson.
superseded by Alonso and Kimi Räikkönen.
The other thing that strikes me about Webber is, of course, he's very much a down-to-earth guy. And I imagine that his relationship with all the people involved with Jaguar is very much on a one-to-one level. And I imagine he gets on with the mechanics very well. And that sort of interaction between the team and the driver is essential.
Well, that, of course, is that's one of the things that made Michael Schumacher such a star, was of his interaction with the mechanics and the team and the top, you know, the top echelon of management too. He just, as you said, moulded the team to him perfectly.
Well, because Jaguar is basically a bureaucracy now, if they actually said to Mark Webber, just do what you want, Mark. If you want this engineer, we'll get him. If you want this mechanic, we'll get him. I think Jaguar then would make serious progress.
So David's putting his number on Montoya. What about you guys? Who's the next world champion of that group? Very quickly.
Kimi Räikkönen.
Kimi Räikkönen.
So 2 for Kimi, 1 for Montoya. We'll find out.
It might be Montoya.
Okay, now he's hedging just a bit. All right, time to take another quick break. We will return, and we'll discuss the teams that competed in the 2003 season. Which one will be the next contender? Who will stay on top, and who will fall into a downward spiral? Stick around.
David Coulthard comes around the last turn. He's going to go across the start-finish line, get the checkered flag, and he has the victory in Australia. Ralf Schumacher's the winner here at the Nürburgring, the European Grand Prix. Michael Schumacher wins the United States Grand Prix.
Welcome back to our Formula One Roundtable. Guys, this year we saw 8 winners come from 5 teams. We've talked about the drivers. Let's talk about the teams. Obviously, we always have those top 3, it seems. Is Renault the real deal? Are they going to edge in? Is it going to be suddenly the top 4 from now on?
Well, they've lost Mike Gascoigne for a start. I mean, that's going to have an effect. Their chief engineer, the guy that was very, very good, put the team together really in an engineering sense. But Steve might have more input on that than I.
That's right. Mike Gascoigne, of course, now signed for Toyota, so that's him out of the fray, man. Also, John Illy, their chief aerodynamicist, who helped to create that beautifully sleek-looking R23 chassis. John Illy is now left and has become head of aerodynamics at Ferrari. So 2 very key players have left. On top of that, remember, they're scrapping their wide-angle 110, 111-degree V10 and going to a 72-degree brand-new design. So they have got it all to do again to try and replicate the success, potential success that we saw this year.
So on the engine, they've gone from the sublime to the core blimey then, really. I mean, they've really narrowed the angle down to 72 degrees from 111, so that's going to be a big change in the way the engine sits.
Well,
in
it's
the
the old
chassis.
Supertech engine, isn't it, basically?
Yeah.
But we've seen so many teams that nibble. You know, Sauber nibbling at number 4. Possibly can they edge in? You know, and the question is anybody ever going to break into that top 3? You know, Toyota's got the money.
McLaren did their best. McLaren did their best to break out of the top 3 this year, didn't they? Do a new car, massive development, massive budget, freeze the other car, did nothing with the existing car, and never even raced the new car. So, considering they had a fantastic year, but I mean, what a mistake for a team of McLaren's quality to make. To have a new car that never actually turned a wheel in a race.
They did quite a few changes to the current car, which obviously really was incredibly successful.
Only from about August onwards, though. I mean, you've got to say, if they just concentrated on that car from the start of the year, they might well have won the championship.
Well, of course, with a bit of luck, you know, I mean, Kimi Raikkonen, if he hadn't blown up at the Nürburgring when he was leading just so handily in that European Grand Prix, would have made an incredible difference
Definitely.
to the,
Well,
to the
don't
World
forget,
Championship picture.
he also, in theory, won the Brazilian Grand Prix, and it was only Michael Schumacher that a couple of days later said, hang on, we've done some stats here, and it looks to us as if Giancarlo Fisichella actually won this race. They then gave the win to Giancarlo, but if that hadn't happened, if Michael hadn't done that, Kimi would have finished equal on points with Michael in the championship.
Who's stronger going into 2004? Coming, you know, into this season, it seemed like Ferrari had the momentum, but when you look at the teams from last year, who has the strength going into next season?
Well, the one we haven't mentioned, of course, is Williams. I mean, what about Williams next year? They've been looking pretty racy all year. I mean,
They
Ralph
adapted,
Schumacher
they
had that
changed.
incredible run in the middle of the season there.
Yeah, they fell off they lost the plot a little bit in the last 3 to 4
Yeah, they
races, but I think that was more Montoya not really reacting in the right way to championship
But on the other
pressure.
hand, Montoya, I mean, he rocketed off into the lead in Japan.
Yeah, with no more pressure on him, he was back to the Montoya we know and love.
Steve, jump in here.
Hydraulics problem, of course, that put Montoya out of that race in Japan. How are they going to do next year? I think their big saving grace at Williams is the fact that they've got Frank Durney on board. And we saw when Frank Durney joined the team, Williams engineering exploded in a way that had never happened before, really, there. The FW25 was all over the place. It was way too stiffly sprung at the back. Frank Durney was signed. Now, remember, Frank Durney was an old-school engineer, had been at Williams 1,000 years ago. I worked with a guy at Banetton, he'd worked for Ligier, he's been all around the place, but he's very much of the old school. That car was transformed from Monaco onwards. Now, if you've got that old school engineering combined with the new aerodynamics that they're going to put on the following year's car for next year, yeah, sure, I think Williams are going to be a big, big threat. And the BMW engine is already fired up and running for 2004.
What about Jag and BAR? We haven't mentioned them much either. I mean, the BAR, I just can't believe that Honda, who was so successful in Formula One, are not going to jump into the void somewhere. Mr. Fukui, the new old head worldwide, is a racer. He came up through the ranks of management, of engineering management, and he's keen on the Formula One, and I think, I can't believe they're not going to put a massive step forward.
I agree with you, David, but for a different reason. I think Takuma Sato is going to play a very important role between BAR and Honda and get those two companies finally to talk to one another. He's a very bright guy, Sato, and that is his greatest contribution to the team, I think.
And he's obviously, after that Japanese race, quick enough.
He's
I
really
mean, I don't think he's a...
we shouldn't forget Sato when we talk about new guys for the future. He's a
I mean,
potential Grand Prix winner, for sure.
The way he won that British Formula 3 championship, 3 years ago now, was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, he just cleaned up, and that's always supposed to be a big marker point.
All right, time for another commercial break, but do not go anywhere. When we return, we'll discuss the new race weekend format for 2004. It's changing. Stay with us.
The 2003 Formula One Roundtable is brought to you by Porsche. Porsche, there is no substitute.
Rules in position for 2004, the weekend format will be altered drastically. There's no private testing session or provisional qualifying on Friday. There will, however, be 2 free practice sessions. Saturday, we'll still have 2 practice sessions, and qualifying will consist of 2 sessions, each of which will have the drivers take 1 flying lap. Tire allocation, well, that'll remain at 20 sets of dry. However, 3 of those sets will be used solely on Friday. Extreme weather tires are allowed, but only when the stewards deem them necessary. Another rule change includes 1 engine for the entire race weekend. And finally, the pit lane speed limit has been raised to 100 kilometers per hour. All right, which is the biggest rule change in all that? 1 engine per
weekend? I think
weekend?
the 1 engine per weekend is probably the most significant rule in there. It's just a huge change for these people to have to do. And of course, what we don't see in the rules there is if you change the engine, you go to the back, right?
You're going to lose 10 spots on the
10
grid, my
spots.
understanding at the moment. But you're right, they've increased that. The duty cycle of the engine is basically doubled now, from 450 kilometres up close now to around 1,000 kilometres. How's that going to affect the engine design? I think it'll be a little bit heavier because you're going to have more material around the piston crown for increased reliability. And I think really the level of development will stop at about what the 2003 engines are. I don't think you'll see the revs drop too much, probably about 500 RPM. But of course, it's only going to take one engine designer, i.e. Mercedes or BMW, to start tweaking the revs up. And the rest are going to have to follow suit because they will lose pace instantly.
Yeah, and I think a follow-on from that is that Friday will become much less of an event because some of the teams at the back of the grid are going to do a minimal amount of running because of the engine problem now. They're not going to want to put any mileage on the car. So Friday, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen there. But the biggest thing that we had this year, of course, is one-lap qualifying in a spec that you have to run at the start of the race, and that is still there in effect. So we still basically have this new type of regulation.
But now the drivers have two shots at it. David Coulthard now can make a mistake and come back. Kimi Räikkönen can make a mistake and come back, unlike what happened this year.
Well, they've got those 3 sets of tyres on Friday that they have to use on Friday. You can't carry those tyres over and use them on Saturday. And the tyre choice for the rest of the race weekend has to be set before 9 a.m. on the Saturday. So it really forces the teams to run on Friday. That's what those 3 sets of tyres are for.
They'll run, but how much running will they do? That's the point.
The absolute minimum.
All right, here's a question.
Peter.
Will it be better? Will it be better racing next year because of the rule changes that have been made?
No.
I don't think it's going to make it. Can't see how it can make it any better. It can. What Peter says there about only running a minimal mileage on Friday, because the other thing on Friday, you can run 3 drivers too. And you can do it. You can, in theory, do a lot of testing on the Friday. But as you say, if you haven't got the dough and you're not quite sure about the engine, you're not going to want to do much testing anyway.
I find it difficult to answer the question, will it be better? Because I never thought there was anything wrong with the system in 2002. So,
no, me neither. I absolutely 100% agree with you. We should have 2 flat-out qualifying sessions. Put the race fuel in after the qualifying sessions are finished.
100%.
Put the things into Parc Fermé, and if that's what Mac wants to do, and Charlie Whiting, the chief surgeon here, wants to keep his eye on them, fine. But let's really see the pace of the cars. Let qualifying be a qualifying session. Push the things.
How fast can they go?
Earlier in the show, we were talking about poles that Michael has.
Exactly.
You can't compare them anymore because getting the pole this year didn't mean as much. Look at Montoya, 6 poles in 2002. 1 or 2 in 2003.
Well, the big question was we didn't know what it meant after each session when it was over. We didn't really know how fast they were going, what the setup was. The changes will come, and we'll be discussing them again next year. Time to take one last break. But when we return, we'll cram everything else we're talking about in our famous lightning round. Stay with us.
Roundtable is brought to you by Pioneer Plasma Displays, taking high-definition television to a whole new level, and by Subaru, driven by what's inside.
Welcome back. Time for the lightning round. I have right here topics, and we're going to go through them as fast as we possibly can. Number 1, who's going to be the next world champion?
The next world championship, in spite of all this talk of young drivers, new teams, is going to be Michael Schumacher.
Steve?
Michael Schumacher will win the championship next year. Kimi Räikkönen is the power to be.
Rubens Barrichello.
Ah, that's a leap. All right, most overrated driver in Formula 1.
Most overrated driver this year in Formula 1 was probably Antonio Pizzoni.
Next.
Jacques Villeneuve, too expensive for how much they paid him for the points. It just didn't work.
Well, now that Eddie Irvine's out of Formula 1, it has to be Villeneuve.
All right. Let's talk about the most underrated driver.
The most underrated driver, boy, that's hard. I should think Mark Webber probably. It was about halfway through the year that people suddenly realised how good Mark Webber was.
Sato definitely will be a force to be reckoned with.
But he wasn't there this year. Who was
no, he
this
wasn't.
year?
Well, I would say Webber.
All right.
Webber
Underrated.
too, although I always rated Webber, so I can't say he was underrated. I always thought he was fabulous even in Formula 3, so I'd have to go for Sato, and he was there. He did the last race, of course.
What about Nicolas Chiesa and all this? Come on. If you're not rated at all. All right, let's move on. When is Schumacher going to quit?
I think Schumacher will quit when he starts getting beaten on a regular basis, when he really does get beaten and not just have mechanical problems.
I give him 2 more years. I think pressure from the wife and the family to quit racing and enjoy the cash.
He needs a bit more money.
I think he was always going to retire at the end of 4, whether or not he won in 2003, and I think he'll have a validatory year, and then he'll retire and be happy for the rest of his life.
DC's on the bubble at big time at McLaren. David Coulthard, is he ever going to be world champion? Is David going to be out of Formula One in a year?
I think David Coulthard will never be world champion. He's made an awful lot of money. He's had an incredible run, and I think next year when he gets moved on by Montoya, I think he'll probably give up.
Yeah, I agree. Great guy. He's not going to be world champion. A lot of money. Quit and enjoy it.
Enormous talent, working very hard still, one of the fittest guys in Formula One. I think he can be world champion.
Very quick, new points or old points?
Well, I like the new points going down to 8, but I still think there should be a bigger gap between first and second. The winner should really reap benefit of it.
Steve?
Second and third on the podium should equal first place in points, so I go for the old system.
Don't change anything. I love the old system. Old and no change is good.
Last question, will Ralf Schumacher ever be world champion?
Not while his brother's around.
No.
Yes.
Well, that's about it for this year's Formula One Roundtable. There is still a lot to talk about, and we at Speed Channel look forward to next season, where we will again be the American home for the Formula One World Championship. So for Peter Windsor, Steve Matchett, and David Hobbs, I'm Rick DeBroil. Look forward to seeing you back here in March for the 2004 season.